May we share a word of prayer together. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing and strengthening to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. One thing I can say about the work of systemic justice, it is less about concepts and more about stories. Justice work has champions for it, and there are lots of people out there doing significant work around justice that's worth telling. And this particular week, over the last 10 days, we lost two significant figures to justice on the global scene. This last week, some of us were able to attend the Dialogue Institute annual dinner, which is it was their 18th annual dinner. And it was a mix of celebration and grief, all in the same gathering. They lost their Turkish Muslim leader, Fethullah Gulen, who helped create the Hizmet movement of service and peace, rising up out of Turkey, recognizing the unrest in that country, recognize there's an alternate way in which humans can behave and live with one another through acts of service and kindness and compassion, of truly getting to know another person through dialogue, conversation, and time with one another. That through those mechanisms, human peace is a tangible thing, not just some ethereal concept floating out there, something that actually can be achieved because human beings are interacting and doing things together. The Dialogue Institute is a direct product of Fethullah's work and efforts around the globe. And our small little chapter here in the Kansas City is one of multitude of places all around the world of people creating conversations and meaning, advocating for service and community and justice and peace and relationship building, recognizing that we have far more in common than is different from one another. And we recognize that even when someone like that passes away, that the work continues with even greater vigor to honor the work that some person has done, recognizing they didn't do it for themselves, they did it for humanity in the first place. That's one. The other that may or may not know is a person of Peruvian background, Gustavo Gutierrez, who is really considered one of the founders of what we call liberation theology. Grew out of the challenges in Peru, recognizing in his day and time, 2% of the Peruvian population owned 90% of the land in that country. And because of that, began a social justice uprising of people focusing on those that were poor and poverty. He was most well known for his phrase, the preferential option for the poor. That you begin working at the place of greatest need. And when you work at the place of greatest need, creates the opportunity for greatest change to happen in society. Gustavo Gutierrez, every time I maybe have mentioned him in a sermon, I know that Eugenio would say, I know him really well, know of him, and would speak of him and know of the work that he did. Now, these two figures were justice figures. They were not just people that believed in wanting things to be different. They were about changing the very systems in which people behaved so that everyone had greater equity in their life. Because if we just kind of carry on and do good work with the same unjust systems, we don't get any better results from that. I began thinking of the priest out of El Salvador. And the one, I can't think of his name, it's Oscar Romero, thank you very much. Oscar Romero, who did all the work in El Salvador, recognizing the work that he'd done in that country. And every time we go down to El Salvador, and I've been there twice, there is just a significant influence of what Alfa Romero did in that country to bring about the uprising in the middle of military discord, recognizing that people that were in poor communities were the ones that suffered the greatest. And whether it's in their community, or in another town called Suchitoto, or in San Salvador, the capital of that country, you can see his name on the wall of remembrance. You can see stories about him in a museum that's a museum from the perspective of those that have been marginalized in their country. Figures like this make a significant difference. And you think, why am I talking about all these figures that are not even from here? When I think about this passage in Luke, this Luke chapter 4 that Brandy beautifully told us this morning and shared with us in story form. You have Jesus that makes his way to his hometown. And there's something nostalgic about going to your hometown. Some people may still be living in their hometown if they're here in Olathe. But if you've gone away and you come back, there's something kind of nostalgic about coming back to your hometown. I remember coming back to my hometown of San Angelo, Texas, post-seminary, coming back to preach for the very first time in my home church. And all people could talk about was how tiny I used to be. They remember me back then and not kind of let me be the person that I was. It's so hard to go back when people have certain memory. When you're gone, their memory is when they last saw you, last remember you, how hard it is to go back to somewhere. Well, Jesus was headed back to Nazareth, and he headed to the synagogue. And he's given the opportunity to read from the scroll that day while they're in their service and doing their worshipful work. And when he unrolls the scroll, it's the Isaiah scroll. The recovery of sight to the blind, the oppressed go free, release of the captives, the year of Jubilee. All these sound great until you have to do them. It sounds like this is the world we should live in. But he goes back to his hometown and he gets questioned. He goes, weren't you that carpenter's son? Aren't you Joseph's son? Yeah, well, why should we believe you? I remember when you were this little kid. Why should I listen to anything you have to say? Jesus was trying to tell them, when I share these words, we don't just read the words from the Torah just to read the words from the Torah saying this was the reading for the day. We're supposed to read these words because it's supposed to mean something in our life. It's supposed to change the way we live with one another. It's supposed to change the way we are equitable to one another and how we engage one another. So I began thinking about kind of modern day people that are kind of these justice figures for us. And we have the fortune in the Disciples of Christ tradition to be able to claim William Barber as kind of one of us. And if you don't know William Barber, he is one of the ones that helped orchestrate the Poor People's Campaign that has been going on for several years in the United States, advocating for the poor, advocating for those that are the ones with the gap between the haves and the have-nots. He often calls his movement the repairs of the breach, is kind of lessening the divide of the haves and the have-nots, recognizing if we don't not side with those of the have-nots, they will never have opportunities for their life to be better. And not only advocating them for advocating the systems in which we live to be changed and transformed in some way. Just so pleased a year ago summer that several of our youth that went to the General Assembly got to go to Beargrass Christian Church where he was the guest preacher for the day. And our young people got to hear him preach. And man, does he thunder in the room. And his presence is powerfully known. And I remember one of the things I remember most of all the youth comments, I remember Jackson Seitz coming out of the sanctuary and goes, man, that was powerful. He even took his binder notes and just threw it out into the crowd. He was just animated and ready to go. I mean, he energized that room. And for our young people to hear and feel the energy of justice in that space activates something in them that is powerful and significant. I think of my colleague in Fort Worth, Texas, Katie Hayes. She started a church about 8-9 years ago called Galileo, and its mission is to spiritual refugees. People who have been hurt, harmed, traumatized by church in the past, saying, give church a second chance. Similar values and theology to St. Andrew Christian Church, almost like a newer version of St. Andrew 25 years later from when St. Andrew was started. One of the cool things about Galileo's church, in the 8-9 years it's been in existence in the southwest region, which is all of Texas and New Mexico, more people have been ordained out of that congregation than any other congregation in Texas and New Mexico. The values of justice and advocating for people is speaking to people. We can either stay in our comfortable places and be complacent where we are, or we can choose to have our life be different and change in some way. And we can say to ourselves, well, I got so much stuff on my own plate. I've got my own trauma I've got to work through. I've got my own hardships I got to navigate through in my life. And I'm reminded of Henry Nouwen when I was in college, when I first took my first class in undergrad thinking about ministry. The first book I was asked to read was a book by Henry Nouwen called The Wounded Healer. And The Wounded Healer says that if we wait until all our wounds are fixed before we go out and help other people, nothing will ever happen in the world. We can't just imagine that all this gets healed immediately. We know that grief and pain and trauma carries with us for a long time. In a lot of ways, it's informative to how we live and how we function in the world. We can't look at the ills of the world, put on a little Band-Aid and say, well, that's that. We'll move on to the next thing. Our role as justice makers, systemic justice changers, is not about Band-Aids. It's about actually healing the wound, not covering it up, but actually working on the wound itself so it can be healed. The work of systemic justice is not an easy thing to navigate and do. It usually is kind of going upstream in terms of how the rest of society kind of set the norms. And so we're trying to kind of upend the very norms that we think are unjust in some way. I mean, just think about some of the things that have happened just in the last 40, 50 years that's worthy of noting without advocacy to make it happen. It's not that long ago that women couldn't vote. And it's not that long ago where that wasn't an option. It's not that long ago when a person of color was considered a percentage of a person. That's crazy talk. It's more recently, not that long ago, when a person could choose to love someone else and legally get married, whoever it was they chose they wanted to marry. Marriage equality is not that old of an advocacy that's new for our country. None of those things would have happened. None of those systemic things would have happened unless there was a rising up of people to say, no, there's greater and better answers to living in community with one another unless we do something about it. Brian was highlighting that in his reparations talk today. Sometimes talk is cheap. Sometimes we have to follow up our talk with our action. And that's where the difference is made. And then the other challenging part of the justice part is it feels overwhelming. We look at the list of things we can tackle. We have to kind of rise out of the passions of what we believe in and what's important to us and recognize we're not in the work alone. We find partnerships with people to do this work because we know systemic change is possible with two primary ingredients: people and money is how change initially begins to happen. And we've made some of those partnerships in this church that allow our voice to be bigger than just our congregation's voice. Sometimes we've partnered with More Squared. We've done it this last year with 7 rallies to speak out against white Christian nationalism and to speak for the beloved community and what those values are and why they're important. We have partnered with KIFA, Kansas Interfaith Action. And by partnering with them, one of the things we're beginning to do is beginning to advertise a petition for better use of our public school systems, that public dollars stay with public schools and not go to voucher systems. We're advocating for our kids and that all kids have an opportunity to receive equitable education across the board in our state. KIFA will be having times during the legislative session. If there's a legislator you want to talk to, they're going to have Topeka days. You can drive to Topeka and they'll help introduce you to legislators if you want to talk to them about the things you want to see changed and different in the world. Rather than like, well, I hope things change, your voice matters. So when we get our church together, we had right at 50 people this morning, close to 100 people in here. We get 150 people all moving down the same path, doing the same thing. Powerful things happen, except it's not enough. We need to partner with Second Baptist Church, who we share mobile food pantry with, get their 100 people, add them to our 150 people. We've got 250 people moving down the same path, doing something important. Then we go down the street to the Methodist Church and find those 200 people, add them to ours, and we make the group larger. We show up somewhere, if it's 10 people, not going to pay attention. If it's 1,000 people, someone's going to pay attention to that and want to respond to what is the community saying about how we live in equity with one another. The partnerships are viable and around us, all around us. It's whether we choose to engage them or not. And we have people that have risen up, people like I've mentioned today, that have gotten some passion that's welled up within them. I know for me, some of my passion comes from people telling me I can't do something. As soon as someone tells me I can't do it or it's not possible, my entire goal is to prove that it is possible and that I may not do it by myself, but with others, we're going to make this happen. I'll never forget the first week of seminary. We had to take all these entrance exams. They don't do this anymore. You took all these exams, all these diagnostics, and someone would sit down with you and go over the results of what your seminary life was going to be like. I remember doing all these things. I sit down with this professor and he goes, well, based on the results, you're going to do really poorly in this seminary. You're not going to get good grades. You'll just be relegated to C's. And I was like, in my mind, I was going, I can't believe this guy's telling me this. My entire seminary life partly was to prove him wrong. I mean, when you've got this why of why you're going to do something, it's an extreme, powerful motivator of how we go about changing the world. If you're driving down the street and you notice hunger, if you drive down the street and you see police pulling over people of color for no apparent reason, I mean, you can go down the list of where our passions well up from to do something. We need to motivate the passions within us to tackle the very systems that by nature don't want to change. They'd rather just stay the same and kind of feed us little bits of bread to make us feel good. We know the actual system itself is wrong. It's unjust and unequitable for humanity. The interesting thing about this passage from Luke, when Jesus returns to his hometown to read from the scroll, and they get angry with him. How would you even, you were the carpenter's son. To me, in my mind is, what did you expect? This is the boy that came to the synagogue every week and heard the Torah scrolls, heard words from the prophets and words from all the figures. Jesus actually believed them when they said those words when he was a young child. He simply returned to Nazareth and said, I'm ready to do the work. This is the work I'm going to do. This is the work you taught me to do. And they got angry for him actually living out the very thing that community had nurtured him to do. It's ironic sometimes that the systems can get callous to the very purpose by which they're created in the first place. So we need some Futala Galans and some Gustavo Gutierrez and Alfa Romeros and William Barbers and Katie Hayes of the world. My guess is the next one might just be in this room. And you can look around. Who's it going to be? And if you're looking at someone else is looking at you, so look out.